The halls of Congress, they're always humming with activity, aren't they?
Oh, definitely.
A single day can just feel like a blur of votes, debates, declarations, and trying to keep up with what's happening, who's arguing about what, and maybe most importantly, what it actually means for you and me out here.
Mm.
Well, it can feel impossible sometimes.
It really is a fire hose of information. You've got these
Yeah.
huge policy battles happening right alongside, really technical debates, confirmations, even members just recognizing folks back home. It's all in the mix every single day.
Exactly. And that's precisely why we're doing this deep dive. We've basically taken a stack of sources, mainly excerpts from the Congressional Record from just one day, June 3rd, 2025. And our mission is to cut through that noise.
Right.
We want to identify the most important actions and debates from that day, really understand the substance, the politics behind it, and figure out what it tells us about where things stand in Washington. Think of this as your guide to getting Congress in context.
Yeah, we're trying to go beyond just the headlines and, provide the analysis that turns all that raw legislative activity into something understandable.
Okay, let's jump right into June 3rd then. Where did the sources show the main legislative energy was focused that day?
Well, the central focus, based on the material we looked at, was pretty clearly on the ongoing debate around the Republican reconciliation legislation. This is a really big bill that, as of June 3rd, had passed the House and just moved over to the Senate.
Okay, reconciliation. And the sources laid out some pretty fundamental disagreements about this bill, didn't they? What were the core points of contention being argued on the floor?
Yeah, the debate really centered heavily on the bill's projected impact, both on everyday Americans and the national debt. For instance, members on the Democratic side were really sharply criticizing proposed cuts to health care coverage. Claims were made, and they cited analysis like one from the Kaiser Family Foundation saying something like 140,000 people just in Connecticut could lose coverage. And the national projection, potentially 15 million people.
15 million. Wow. I mean, those are really high stakes numbers being thrown around right there.
Absolutely. And
Oh,
that's tied directly to the bill's projected cost, which many sources estimated would significantly add to the national debt. Figures between like $3 trillion and $5 trillion were mentioned.
3 to 5 trillion.
Yeah. And the argument being made by opponents is that this debt increase plus the cuts is mainly to fund tax reductions that, disproportionately benefit the wealthiest Americans, kind of rewarding the top 1% while shifting the burden onto working families and more vulnerable people.
Okay, so the debate frames it as tax cuts for some, leading to debt increases and cuts for others. What specific programs were highlighted as facing cuts, besides healthcare?
Well, beyond healthcare, significant cuts to food supports were a really major point of contention. Specifically, a proposed $300 billion reduction to programs like SNIP.
SNP, that's the food stamp program, basically.
Right, the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program helps low-income families buy food. It was argued this cut would make groceries more expensive and directly hit about 42 million households. We're talking families with kids, seniors, people with disabilities, veterans.
42 million households.
Yeah. And one member made a powerful point, saying this assistance often boils down to just $6 a day per person, but it's critical for lifting millions out of poverty.
That figure, $6 a day, really puts the scale of that proposed cut into perspective for, actual people. Were there any other particularly controversial provisions highlighted in the sources?
Yes, there was one provision that drew really strong criticism, especially from Democrats worried about gun violence. It was the elimination of registration and ownership requirements for silencers.
Silencers.
Yeah. Opponents argued this move would weaken public safety measures, make things harder for law enforcement, and it directly clashes with, ongoing calls for action on gun violence.
So this single reconciliation bill manages to wrap in huge debates about the national debt, healthcare, poverty, and even touches on gun policy. It sounds like it clearly dominated a lot of the discussion.
It certainly did.
Okay, shifting gears a bit. What else was happening on June 3rd? Let's look at the Senate's actions.
Sure. So over in the Senate, a key development was a procedural vote on S-1582. It's known as the Genius Act.
The Genius Act. What's that about?
It's focused on regulating stablecoins. Those types of cryptocurrency that are supposed to have a stable value, usually linked to something like the U.S. dollar.
Ah, right, stablecoins.
So the motion to proceed with the bill, basically agreeing to debate it, passed with a vote of 59 to 37. That signals the Senate is ready to bring this issue to the floor for, full consideration.
Stablecoins and crypto regulation, Definitely hot topics right now. What were the underlying concerns driving this push for regulation, according to what you saw?
Well, the sources painted a picture of a space that's growing incredibly fast but is often, unregulated and kind of ripe for exploitation. There were big concerns about market volatility, sure, but even more acutely about scams and fraud.
How bad are we talking?
Get this. A figure cited from an FBI report showed Americans lost $9.3 billion just to crypto scams in 2024 alone.
9.3 billion.
Billion, yeah. And overall, crypto-related crime was reported to be up by something like 66%. Just staggering numbers.
Wow, $9.3 billion lost to scams. I mean, that number is hard to even wrap your head around. It sounds like a really serious problem that lawmakers are trying to get a handle on.
It is. And one specific kind of heartbreaking problem highlighted was the use of crypto ATM machines to facilitate these scams, particularly targeting older Americans, senior citizens.
How does that work?
Reports indicated over a third of all the reported complaints involving crypto fraud came from Americans over 50. Scammers use all sorts of tactics, social engineering, convincing victims they owe money for things like missing jury duty or needing to bail out a loved one. Then they instruct them to feed cash into these crypto ATMs.
And once the cash is in?
Once it's transferred into crypto, the money is often just gone,
Yeah.
virtually untraceable.
That really underscores the urgency, doesn't it? And the potential real-world harm driving this legislation. The sources also mentioned it's complex to regulate this stuff, right?
Oh, absolutely. The debate, as it was presented, involves some really thorny issues, like how do you regulate the big online platforms that might handle crypto transactions? Or what do you do about self-custodial wallets?
Where are those?
They give users complete control over their own crypto, which sounds good, but it can also make tracking illegal activity extremely difficult. The proposed amendments mentioned really reflected these technical and legal challenges. It's not simple.
Okay, so beyond stablecoins, what other significant actions did the Senate take that day?
Well, the Senate also passed S-201, which is the ACS Act of 2025. This is a bill requiring the National Academies, Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine to do a big comprehensive study
Study on what?
on the prevalence and mortality of cancer among people who served as active duty aircrew in the U.S. military.
And who counts as aircrew for this study?
The sources defined it pretty broadly. Basically, anyone who served on active duty in the Army, Navy, Air Force, or Marine Corps as an aircrew member on fixed-wing aircraft. So that's pilots, navigators, weapon systems operators, other system operators, really any crew member whose job required them to fly regularly.
And the goal?
The purpose is to finally get some solid, definitive data on potential long-term health risks tied to their service. It's been a concern for a while.
That sounds like really critical work, acknowledging the unique health challenges our service members might face. And the Senate also kept up with its constitutional role of confirming nominations.
Yes, indeed. The sources noted the confirmation of Allison Hooker to be an Undersecretary of State. That passed 59 to 37. It's part of the routine, maybe, but still essential work the Senate handles pretty much daily.
Okay, so major action on crypto regulation, a study on veteran health, and confirmations happening in the Senate. Meanwhile, what was going on over in the House of Representatives on June 3rd?
The House was quite active, too, passing several bills. What's kind of interesting is many of these passed under something called suspension of the rules.
Suspension of the rules, what does that mean?
It's basically a procedural shortcut. They typically use it for bills that aren't seen as very controversial. It requires a two-thirds vote to pass. So seeing bills move this way often signals there's pretty broad support across the aisle. It contrasts sharply with the deep divisions we saw on that big reconciliation bill.
Ah, okay. So that procedural detail itself tells us something about the nature of these particular bills. Which ones went through this process?
Several were focused on supporting small businesses. For example, H.R. 787 passed. This one requires federal contract solicitations to be written in plain language.
Plain language. Why?
Well, the argument is that all the complex technical government jargon makes it unnecessarily hard for smaller businesses who probably don't have big legal departments to even understand and apply for contracts. So this tries to level the playing field a bit.
That feels like a really practical, common sense step, something that could actually make a difference for small business owners trying to work with the government. What were the others?
Also passed under suspension were H.R. 1621, the Entrepreneurs with Disabilities Reporting Act of 2025. That requires the SBA, the Small Business Administration, to identify specific challenges faced by entrepreneurs with disabilities. And H.R. 789, the Transparency and Predictability in Small Business Opportunities Act.
What does that one do?
It requires the SBA to issue rules about what happens when contract solicitations get canceled, and to provide help to businesses affected by that. Members talked about how unfair it is for small businesses to invest a lot of time and money into proposals, only to have the solicitation just disappear without any explanation.
Yeah, that sounds frustrating. It seems like there's some genuine bipartisan concern there about supporting small businesses and making government processes fairer. What about H.R. 1804?
H.R. 1804, the 7A Loan Agent Oversight Act, also passed. This bill specifically targets oversight and aims to cut down on fraud within the SBA's main loan program, the 7A program, which helps get capital to small businesses.
Was there much fraud?
Well, members noted this bill had bipartisan support, and they cited a report from the SBA Inspector General that documented over $335 million lost just to loan agent fraud. So the bill requires the SBA to create a registration system to track data on these agents and report back to Congress. It's an example, I think, of where focusing on specific areas of waste or fraud can actually attract cooperation.
It is interesting to see those pockets of bipartisan work happening even amidst the larger partisan battles. Any other notable discussions or actions in the House that day?
Yeah, a couple other things. Members also discussed supporting legislation related to promoting whole milk consumption. The argument was it's good for childhood nutrition and provides essential support for the dairy industry. They used Pennsylvania as an example of a state where dairy is really economically vital. And the Rules Committee, which is pretty powerful, granted rules for considering several other bills, H.R. 2483, H.R. 2931, H.R. 2966, H.R. 2987. That basically means they're being teed up for floor debate and potential votes very soon. It shows the legislative pipeline is moving.
Okay, wow. We've covered a lot of ground just looking at the legislative calendar for one day. From that huge reconciliation fight to specialized bills on crypto, military health, small businesses. It's a lot.
It really is.
So now let's try to connect some of the themes and debates we saw in these sources to the broader context. What do these specific actions reveal about the economic realities and maybe the social issues Congress is currently grappling with?
Well, one inescapable reality that kept surfacing, especially around the reconciliation bill and other spending talks, is the national debt. One member speaking on the floor cited the current figure at a staggering $36 trillion.
$36 trillion.
Yeah, and they highlighted that the monthly interest cost on that debt alone is $89 billion.
$89 billion just on interest every month. I mean, that's more than the entire Department of Defense budget for a month, isn't it?
That is the exact comparison made in the source material.
Right.
And it's a powerful one, right? It starkly illustrates the scale of the fiscal challenge we're facing.
Yeah.
And this debt, along with the resulting high interest rates, were directly connected by members to the economic pressures on everyday Americans, including the claim that most Americans are actually poorer now than they were, say, 4 or 5 years ago because of inflation.
How did they frame that?
The argument basically was, unless your income has gone up by around 27% or more in that period, inflation has significantly eroded your purchasing power.
That explanation of the inflation impact feels very real to people facing rising costs at the grocery store or the gas pump. The sources also brought up the solvency of major programs like Social Security and Medicare, right? That's tied in.
Yes, absolutely. And with a real sense of urgency, one member projected that the Social Security Trust Fund could actually be empty by 2033.
Empty by 2033, that's not far off.
Not far off at all. And if that happens, and the program sticks to current law, the speaker calculated it could lead to a 21% cut in Social Security checks for retirees, which, they projected, could potentially double the rate of senior poverty in America by 2034.
Doubling senior poverty, that's a really stark projection. It highlights the human impact of these, long-term fiscal challenges.
Exactly. It's presented as this looming crisis that really requires difficult political decisions now, even though there's just no political consensus on how to actually address it.
And Medicare was also mentioned in the context of fiscal issues.
It was. Specifically, the issue of Medicare Advantage fraud was highlighted. Some reports cited in the sources estimate this fraud costs taxpayers over $100 billion a year.
$100 billion a year in fraud.
That's the estimate cited. And this was presented as maybe another area, kind of like some of those small business bills, where bipartisan reform should be possible, save substantial money, improve healthcare outcomes. But it often just gets bogged down in political gridlock.
So even as you have these deep partisan fights over spending priorities in the reconciliation bill, there's this underlying acknowledgement in the sources of these massive structural solvency issues that are just hard to ignore.
Yeah, they're definitely casting a long shadow.
What about social issues? I know anti-Semitism was a significant topic that day.
Yes, it really was. Several members spoke with real passion about the alarming rise in anti-Semitism they're seeing. They detailed specific, honestly horrifying examples from recent events,
Like what?
like the Molotov cocktail attack on the Run for Their Lives group in Boulder, Colorado. The sources made it clear the target was explicitly Jewish people. It resulted in 12 injuries, 8 hospitalizations,
Lord.
including an 88-year-old Holocaust survivor.
Oh my God. That's awful.
It is. Other incidents mentioned included an attack in Washington, D.C., and the firebombing of the Pennsylvania governor's mansion during Passover. Just really disturbing examples.
How are members framing these events in the context of the debate? What was the connection being made?
Well, members in the sources drew what they felt was a crucial distinction. They talked about the difference between criticizing the policies of the Israeli government, which they acknowledged is a legitimate part of political discourse,
Yeah.
and condemning or attacking Jewish people everywhere based on, ancient anti-Semitic tropes.
All right.
They warned against holding all Jewish people collectively responsible for the actions of a government, and really cautioned against allowing anti-Israel sentiment to just devolve into outright anti-Semitism.
That distinction is so important, and it's notable that members were taking the time to emphasize it on the floor. Gun violence was another social issue that came up, wasn't it?
It was, yeah, particularly in the context of its disproportionate impact on specific communities. Statistics were cited highlighting that Black Americans die from gun violence at a rate 2.7 times greater than their white peers.
2.7 times.
Yeah, and that firearm suicides apparently increased by 50% in 2023 among this group. The debate kind of reflected the different approaches lawmakers take. Some calling for stricter gun control measures, others arguing for addressing what they see as root causes like poverty, mental health, breakdown of social structures, things like that.
And the silencer provision.
Right, the controversial silencer provision back in the reconciliation bill was brought up by opponents as something that directly undermines gun violence prevention efforts. So it connects back.
It's just clear from this one day's record that Congress is grappling with some of the most complex and deeply felt economic and social challenges facing the country.
No question.
Stepping back for just a moment, how does reviewing these sources, seeing what happened on June 3rd, help us understand not just what was debated, but maybe how Congress actually operates? The process itself.
Yeah, that's a great point. It gives us practical examples of the machinery at work, right?
Yeah.
We saw a major bill, the reconciliation bill, moving via the reconciliation process that's designed specifically to bypass potential filibusters in the Senate and pass with just a simple majority. It's a procedure used when there's deep partisan division on budget-related stuff.
Okay.
And we contrasted that with those other bills passing under suspension of the rules in the House. That requires a 2/3 vote, showing the mechanism for moving less controversial items efficiently when there is broad consensus.
So the process itself kind of tells you something about the level of political agreement or disagreement surrounding a bill.
Exactly. It's like a built-in signal. We also saw the role of committees, like the House Rules Committee, setting the terms for floor debate on other bills. That shows their control over the legislative flow. And in the Senate, the procedures for confirming nominations and taking those procedural votes, like the motion to proceed on the Genius Act, illustrate the different kinds of business they handle beyond just the final passage of legislation.
It's definitely a complex system, but looking at the specific mechanics for individual bills like this really does help clarify it. So, looking ahead now, what do the proceedings we reviewed from June 3rd suggest about what we can expect next in Washington?
Well, based on these sources, the immediate focus has got to be that reconciliation bill moving into the Senate. That's where the next major legislative battle is going to unfold. We can likely expect intense debate, probably attempts to amend it, and definitely significant political maneuvering given its scope and, the deep partisan divide.
And for the Genius Act on stablecoins, what's next for that?
Having cleared that procedural hurdle in the Senate, it's now poised for further debate and potentially passage there. If it does pass the Senate, it would then need to be considered and passed by the House to become law. So attention would then shift over to the House side.
Right. And those House-passed bills.
Yeah, the ones that passed under suspension, particularly those with bipartisan support, they'll head to the Senate. They probably stand a reasonable chance of moving forward. But it always depends on Senate priorities and, frankly, scheduling.
Okay. What broader trends do you think are reflected in this snapshot of congressional activity from just one day?
I think we clearly see the persistent, deep partisan divide on the major fiscal and social issues. Those are the battles that really dominate the headlines and consume a lot of floor time. But critically, we also see evidence of areas where bipartisan work is still happening, even if it's on narrower issues like, small business support, oversight of government programs, or specific veteran health concerns.
So it's not all gridlock.
Not entirely, no. The urgent fiscal challenges, the national debt, entitlement solvency, they remain constant, looming in the background, even if political solutions seem really elusive right now. And social issues like anti-Semitism and gun violence clearly continue to be powerful drivers of floor speeches and legislative proposals. We also caught a glimpse of that tension between federal and state authority, didn't we? With discussions around things like AI regulation highlighting state concerns about federal overreach.
Yeah. This deep dive into just one day's work in Congress really underscores the sheer volume and, frankly, the complexity of the issues being tackled. From the future of our national finances and healthcare to regulating cutting-edge technology and addressing these really painful social divides.
It definitely shows a system often in conflict, driven by competing philosophies and priorities, but also one that's still capable of finding moments of cooperation on specific issues.
Well, understanding these details, the specific bills, the arguments being made, the procedures being used, it feels key to being well informed in this complex landscape. So maybe a final thought for our listeners. Given the deep divisions we saw on major issues and those glimmers of bipartisan work on others, what role can engaged citizens play? Either in pushing for action on critical challenges like the debt or community safety, or perhaps even helping find some common ground. How does understanding the specific details of these debates, pulled directly from the source material today, change how you view the possibilities for future solutions? Something to think about.